The air in the clinic Valmont was too thin, too pure, and tasted of expensive ozone. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the Swiss Alps rose like a row of jagged, indifferent teeth, draped in a shroud of perpetual white. Inside, the only color was the blinking green rhythm of the cardiac monitor, a small, luminous pulse that was currently the only proof I still belonged to the world of the living. I was 52 years old, but the reflection in the polished chrome of the bedside tray was a stranger. My skin had turned the color of parchment, stretched tight over the sharp, architectural bones of my face. My hands, once capable of the most delicate gene splicing in the Western Hemisphere, lay atop the silk sheets like two dead white spiders. This was the supposed toll of the Mercer-Thorne syndrome, a degenerative neurocondition Julian had named after us, a tragic homage to the woman whose brain was supposedly eating itself. Julian entered first. The scent of Le Labo's Santal 33 reached me before his shadow did. He was wearing a charcoal gray cashmere suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. He looked immaculate, the kind of grief-stricken husband that would look breathtaking on the cover of Forbes' obituary section. Behind him trailed Mia, our 18-year-old miracle. She was draped in a vintage Chanel jacket, her eyes glued to her phone, the screen reflecting in her pupils like tiny digital fires. "The snow is starting to settle on the Eiger, Vivian," Julian said. His voice was a rich baritone, the kind of voice that had convinced 1,000 investors to pour billions into our biotech empire. He reached out, his fingers, cool and dry, brushing my forehead. The touch sent a ripple of static through my nerves. "The doctors say the blood-brain barrier is finally failing. It's a mercy now, a quiet exit for the queen of longevity." I tried to speak. My vocal cords felt like they were made of rusted wire. My throat was a desert. Julian, don't exert yourself, darling," he whispered, leaning closer. His Rolex Submariner clinked against the metal bed rail, a sharp, mechanical sound in the hushed room. "Mia is here to say goodbye. She's been so brave." Mia finally looked up from her phone. There was no moisture in her eyes. Instead, there was a predatory clarity I had never seen before. She stepped toward the bed, the heels of her Louboutins clicking against the sterile linoleum with the precision of a metronome. "I'm going to the Sorbonne next month, Vivienne," Mia said. Her voice lacked the soft lilt she used when asking for a new Porsche. "Julian said the trust fund will clear by then. It's a shame you won't be there to see the Thorne name on the new wing of the medical school, though actually we're changing it to the Mercer wing. It has a better ring to it, don't you think?" I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the alpine wind. It was a clinical detachment, a sudden, terrifying sharpening of my senses. Julian straightened his tie, his reflection captured in the glass of the IV pump. "The Thorne longevity patent is a masterpiece, Vivian, but the fiduciary duty of a CEO is to the shareholders, and the shareholders, namely me and our lovely Mia here, find your continued existence to be a bit of a logistical hurdle. You see, the Foundation's bylaws state that the patent rights transfer to the board upon the death of the founder. If you were to live another 6 months, the automatic sunset clause would have moved those rights to a public trust, and we simply couldn't have that." Julian reached out and touched the IV bag. It was a slow, deliberate movement. My eyes followed his hand. I saw the way the plastic crinkled under his thumb, the way the clear fluid shifted. "You aren't sick, Vivian," he murmured, his face inches from mine. "You've just been microdosed, a synthetic neurotoxin. A derivative of the very peptide you discovered in 2011. It mimics the early onset of neurodegeneration perfectly. Even the Swiss specialists couldn't tell the difference between my love and my poison. I've been putting it in your evening tea for 3 years. Every night, a little more silence. Every night, a little more of your empire becoming mine. My heart rate monitor began to accelerate. Beep, 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 beep. "Watch her pulse, Mia," Julian said, his voice devoid of any emotion other than intellectual curiosity. "This is the final stage of the clinical trial, the systemic collapse." He turned the small plastic dial on the IV tube. In the first-person silence of my own mind, the sound was as loud as a gunshot. Click, click, click. The fluid accelerated. I watched a single bubble of air trapped in the line begin to descend toward my vein. It moved with an agonizing, floating grace. I felt the surge of the concentrated toxin enter my bloodstream, a sudden, icy fire that raced toward my chest. It felt like liquid nitrogen being poured into my heart. Julian's hand moved to the oxygen flow meter on the wall. The device was a simple glass tube with a small silver ball floating in it. He turned the knob. The ball dropped. Clack. The sound of the oxygen cutting off was the sound of the world ending. My lungs began to burn, a dry, frantic heat spreading through my ribs. I tried to gasp, but my diaphragm was a slab of stone. I was a fish on the sand, staring up at the two people I had loved, the two people who were now merely spectators to my extinction. Mia leaned over, her long dark hair brushing against my cold cheek. The scent of her mother's perfume, the lab assistant Isabella, I realized now with a sickening bolt of clarity, clung to her. "Julian told me how you used to hold me when I was 5," Mia whispered, a cruel smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. "How you spent millions on my blood transfusions because you thought I was a poor, dying orphan Julian rescued from Rome. I wasn't an orphan, Vivian. I was his prize, and you were just the incubator for my future wealth. Thanks for the marrow. I'll make sure Isabella wears your diamonds to the funeral." She reached out and patted my cheek, a gesture so dismissive it hurt more than the lack of air. Julian looked at the cardiac monitor. The green line was becoming erratic, a jagged mountain range collapsing into a plain. "The patent transfer documents are already signed, Vivian. I used the power of attorney you gave me when you first started forgetting your passwords. By tomorrow morning, Julian Mercer will be the most powerful man in biotech, and you will be a tragic story about the genius who lived too fast." My vision began to tunnel. The edges of the room were dissolving into a thick, oily blackness. The Swiss Alps vanished. Mia's Chanel jacket blurred into a gray smudge. The only thing left was Julian's face, the man I had built a legacy for, the man who was now watching the life drain out of my eyes with the casual boredom of a man watching a screensaver. The air bubble reached the catheter in my arm. I felt a sharp, sudden pressure. My heart gave one final, violent kick against my ribs, like a bird hitting a window pane. Flatline. The sound of the monitor's continuous beep was the last thing I heard. It was a high, unwavering note of absolute betrayal. I was gone. I was weightless. I was drifting into a void where Julian's voice couldn't reach, where the burn in my lungs was finally silenced, and then the void shuddered. The blackness didn't stay black. It began to vibrate with a low-frequency hum, a sound like a server farm cooling down. The silence was replaced by a familiar domestic cacophony, a distant lawnmower, the chirping of crickets, the heavy, sweet scent of fermented grapes and expensive dirt. I didn't open my eyes. I couldn't, not yet, but I could feel. I felt the weight of a heavy silk robe against my skin, not the paper-thin hospital gown. I felt the plush, velvet upholstery of a high-backed chair. I felt the heat of the California sun through a window, baking the hills of Napa Valley. I reached out a hand that felt heavy, warm, and alive. My fingers brushed a smooth, cool surface. I felt the familiar indentations of a keyboard, the haptic feedback of a silver laptop. I forced my eyes open. I was in my study in Napa. The Mont Blanc pen lay on the mahogany desk, catching the golden afternoon light. My silver Nokia flip phone sat next to it, its small screen lit up with a date that made my blood run cold. August 12th, 2013. The door to the study creaked open. The floorboards, the ones I knew needed a specific oil, groaned under a familiar weight. Julian walked in. He looked 10 years younger, his hair perfectly dark, his face devoid of the cold lines I had just seen in the Swiss Alps. He was carrying a manila folder, his expression practiced and somber. "Vivian, darling," he said, his voice dripping with that same baritone charm. "I just got the file from the orphanage in Rome. Her name is Mia. She's 5 years old, and the doctors say she won't last the winter without our help. It's a tragedy, Vivian, a sign. We have to do something." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I looked at the manila folder, the same one that had been the anchor of my first death. I looked at Julian's eyes, searching for the monster I knew was hiding behind the blue iris. My pulse remained perfectly flat. A clinical detachment settled in my chest, precise and freezing. I reached for the Mont Blanc pen. Julian leaned over the desk, the smell of his Santal 33 cologne filling the air, the same scent that had accompanied my murder. He thought he was presenting me with a daughter. He thought he was presenting me with a legacy. He had no idea that he had just handed me the first page of his own autopsy. I looked at the orphan's photo, and then I looked at Julian. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I simply waited for the moment I could finally watch his world turn neon blue. The sunlight in Napa is different from the light in the Alps. It is thick, golden, and smells of dry earth and fermenting Cabernet grapes. It doesn't scream sterile purity. It whispers of old money and slow, calculated growth. I sat in my mahogany-paneled study, the high back of the Hermes leather chair supporting a spine that was no longer made of brittle glass. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. The skin was supple, glowing with the vitality of a woman in her prime, unmarred by the blue-black bruises of IV failures. On my left wrist, a Cartier tank watch ticked with a faint, rhythmic heartbeat. I checked the date on the silver Nokia 8800 sitting on the desk, a masterpiece of stainless steel and sapphire crystal. August 12th, 2013, 4:14 p.m. In exactly 3 minutes, my first life had ended, though I hadn't known it at the time. That was when Julian had walked through that door with the orphanage dossier, initiating the long game swindle that would lead me to a Swiss flatline. I picked up the Nokia. The weight of it was substantial, a cold, reassuring slab of technology. I slid the protective cover down, a mechanical snick that sounded like a suppressed pistol cocking. My thumb hovered over the keypad. I could call the security detail at the gate. I could have him intercepted before he even crossed the threshold of the Thorne estate. No, I wanted to see him. I wanted to see the predator in his youth before he grew confident enough to pull the plug. The door groaned. It was a subtle, expensive sound. Julian Mercer stepped into the room. He was 32, radiating a boyish, calculated vulnerability. He was wearing a light linen shirt, the top two buttons undone, his skin tanned from a weekend in Montecito. In his hand, he clutched a manila folder, the physical manifestation of my destruction. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world, a tragic hero in a mid-range indie film. "Vivian, darling, I didn't think you'd be back from the lab so early," he said. His voice was warm, a honeyed baritone that had once been my favorite sound. I didn't answer immediately. I watched the way he moved. He walked with a slight, choreographed limp, a remnant of a hiking accident he'd used to garner my sympathy 3 months prior. Now I saw it for what it was, a performance. I observed the way his eyes scanned the room, landing for a fraction of a second on the safe hidden behind the 17th century Dutch oil painting. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at the vault. "I finished the sequence early, Julian," I said. My voice was different, lower, stripped of the soft, domestic edges I used to wear for him. It was the voice of a chief scientific officer. He paused, a flicker of confusion crossing his face before he masked it with a practiced frown of concern. He stepped toward the desk, sliding the manila folder across the mahogany surface. The movement was agonizingly slow. I watched the folder's edges catch the light. The paper was slightly textured, the kind of heavy stock stationery used by premium NGOs to scream legitimacy. It slid over the polished wood with a soft, shushing sound like a snake moving through dry grass. It came to a stop exactly 3 inches from my hands. I just got the final report from the Sister Maria Orphanage in Rome, Julian whispered, leaning over the desk. The scent of his Sandal 33 cologne filled the space between us. In the hospital, that smell had meant death. Here, it meant the hunt. "The girl's name is Mia. She's 5. Vivian, the medical charts. They're devastating. She has a rare hematopoietic disorder, the same one your father was researching before he passed." I looked down at the dossier. I didn't open it. I knew what was inside: forged blood work, a photo of a pale girl with Isabella's eyes, and a heart-wrenching plea for a merciful benefactor. "A tragedy," I murmured. "It's more than that," Julian urged, his hand reaching out to cover mine. I pulled my hand back to adjust my watch, a smooth, clinical movement that left his fingers hovering in empty air. He didn't miss a beat. "We have the resources, Vivian. Thorn Genetics is about to go through a Series A funding round. If we announce that our first major project is a non-profit cure for Mia, the PR alone would triple our valuation. But more importantly, we can save her. We can take her in. We can be the family she never had." He was good, the way his lower lip trembled slightly, the way he invoked my father. It was a surgical strike on my empathy. In my first life, I had opened that folder, seen the face of a dying child, and handed Julian the keys to my kingdom. I had redirected $50 million in seed funding from our longevity research to build a private clinic for a child who wasn't even sick, effectively giving Julian a black budget playground for his mistress. I reached out and touched the corner of the folder. The paper felt cheap under my fingertips. I slid it back toward him. I didn't use much force, just a steady, dismissive push. The folder hit his chest and fell to the desk with a limp thud. "No," I said. Julian froze. He blinked, the script in his head suddenly hitting a dead end. "No? What do you mean, no? Vivian, she's a child. She's your blood in a way, through the research. I mean, Julian, that Thorn Genetics is not a foster care agency, I said, leaning back. The leather of the chair creaked, a sound of heavy, unyielding authority. My fiduciary duty is to the Thorn estate and our primary investors. We are a biotech firm focused on cellular regeneration, not a boutique clinic for orphans with convenient timing. Vivian, this isn't like you, he stammered, his face flushing a mottled red. The boyish charm was cracking, revealing the frustrated ego beneath. You're being cold. This is a 5-year-old girl's life. If her life is in danger, Julian, send the file to the Red Cross or the Mayo Clinic, I replied. I picked up my Mont Blanc pen, the heavy, gold-nibbed instrument that had signed away my life support in the future. I began to unscrew the cap, the threads turning with a precise, metallic friction. I've reviewed the estate's premarital assets this morning. This house, the lab, and the primary patents are all under a Thorn-only lock. Your Eternal Care project? It's a liability. I'm canceling the budget for the outreach program, effective immediately. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the crickets outside seemed to stop. Julian stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He looked like a man who had walked into a room he thought he owned, only to find the locks had been changed while he was in the hallway. You're canceling the budget? He hissed, his voice dropping the baritone warmth. I've already made promises to the board, Vivian. I've told them we're expanding. Then you've lied to the board, Julian. That sounds like a you problem, I said. I dipped the pen into the inkwell, a dark, obsidian pool. I began to write a list of names on a fresh sheet of parchment. Dominic Vane, Simon Vance, names of the sharks I would unleash by sunset. Julian slammed his hand on the desk. The silver Nokia jumped. I am the CEO of Eternal Care, Vivian. You can't just You are a contracted administrator of a subsidiary that I own, I interrupted, my voice as flat as a heart monitor's final note. I didn't look up from my writing. And as of 4 minutes ago, that subsidiary is undergoing a full IP audit. My security team is currently at your outreach office in Oakland. They are revoking your server access and collecting all corporate hardware. Julian stepped back, his chest heaving. The limping, hiking injury was gone now. He stood on both feet, his posture aggressive and desperate. You're insane. You've lost your mind. Actually, Julian, I said, finally looking up. The sunlight caught the blue of my eyes, and for a second I saw my own reflection in his pupils, a cold, terrifying version of the woman he thought he had tamed. I've never been more lucid. I see everything now, the orphans, the Rome files, the evening tea. His eyes widened at the mention of the tea. A microscopic tremor started at the corner of his left eyelid. He didn't know how I knew. He couldn't. The tea, he whispered. Get out, Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of an executioner's blade. Take your orphan files and your linen shirts and get out of my house. If you're still on the property by 5 p.m., I'll have you removed for trespassing. And Julian, he stopped at the door, his hand trembling on the brass handle. Don't bother calling Isabella, I added. I've already frozen the wire transfers to her consultancy account. She doesn't answer the phone for men who are broke. Julian didn't speak. He turned and fled, the sound of his frantic footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. I sat in the silence of my study, the scent of his cologne still lingering like a bad memory. I picked up the Nokia and dialed a number I had memorized in the dark of a Swiss clinic. Dominic, this is Vivian Thorne. I need a forensic audit on a parasite. Start with the Oakland motel records and the Rome orphanage wire trails. I want him stripped to the bone before the Series A opens. I hung up, picked up the manila folder he had left behind, and dropped it into the shredder. The sound of the paper being torn into 1,000 white ribbons was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. The game hadn't just changed, I had burned the board. The headquarters of Thorne Genetics sat atop a hill in South San Francisco, like a monolith of glass and brushed aluminum, a temple dedicated to the high-stakes religion of longevity. As I stepped out of the black town car, the wind from the bay bit at my neck, smelling of salt and industrial progress. I didn't shiver. The cold was a familiar companion now, a reflection of the clinical frost settling over my own heart. I walked toward the lobby's rotating glass doors, the sound of my heels, bespoke, steel-tipped stilettos, struck the granite pavement with the rhythmic finality of a gavel. Clack, clack, clack. In my first life I had walked through these doors with a distracted smile, my mind preoccupied with Mia's fictitious blood counts or Julian's latest visionary request. I had been a scientist who forgot she was also a sovereign. Today, I was the sovereign reclaiming her borders. I reached the security turnstile. The guard, a man named Marcus who had worked here for 6 years, looked up with a casual nod. Morning, Dr. Thorne. Mr. Mercer said you might be taking the day off for. He stopped mid-sentence as I reached into my alligator skin bag. I pulled out my ID badge. It was a heavy piece of encrypted plastic embedded with a gold-plated microchip. I didn't just tap it, I held it between my thumb and forefinger, feeling the microscopic ridges of the Thorne family crest etched into the corner. I pressed it against the reader. Beep. The sound was sharp, high-pitched, and absolute. The turnstile's light transitioned from a stagnant red to a vibrant, welcoming green. The mechanical lock disengaged with a heavy, satisfying thud. I pushed through, the brushed metal cold against my hip. I was back inside the machine I had built, and the machine recognized its mother. Marcus, I said, pausing as the turnstile clicked shut behind me. Mr. Mercer's access has been flagged for IP audit. If he attempts to enter before 9 a.m., do not engage. Simply call the SFPD. He is no longer authorized to bypass the secondary biometric filters. Marcus's jaw didn't drop, but his eyes widened, the pupils dilating in a flash of professional panic. Understood, Dr. Thorne. I headed for the express elevator to the 40th floor. The lift was a vacuum-sealed capsule of silence, the G-force pressing me into the floor as it ascended. When the doors slid open, the air smelled of filtered oxygen and high-end floor wax. My assistant, Clara, a sharp-featured woman who could organize a coup during a coffee break, met me at the desk. She was already holding a tablet. "The trust decanting is complete, Vivian," she whispered, falling into step behind me. "The assets have been moved from the Mercer-Thorne joint account into the Thorne legacy shell. Julian's personal burn rate is currently being subsidized by a credit line that, well, it doesn't exist anymore." "And the NDA enforcement?" I asked, my voice echoing in the sterile hallway. The letters went out at 6 a.m. Every lab tech in his eternal care project has been reminded that talking to Julian about Thorne proprietary sequences is a federal offense. He's been siloed. I walked into the executive boardroom. The room was a vast expanse of glass, overlooking the fog rolling over the Golden Gate Bridge. I sat at the head of the table, the seat Julian had occupied for the last 3 years while I hid in the lab. I opened my laptop. The The screen was a black mirror for a second before the facial recognition logged me in. I navigated to the corporate security interface. Julian's digital footprint was laid out before me in a series of glowing blue nodes. I saw his active sessions. He was currently logged in from his laptop in the Napa estate, likely trying to figure out why his Sister Maria wire transfers were bouncing. I hovered my cursor over the Global Deauthorize button. This was the digital execution. I took a breath, the air filling my lungs with a cold, sharp clarity. My finger hovered over the enter key. I noticed the way the light from the monitor caught the diamond on my wedding ring, the ring Julian had bought with a Thorne Genetary Research grant. I felt a surge of clinical disgust. I pressed the key. The mechanical click of the enter button was a tiny sound, yet it reverberated through the quiet room like a landslide. On the screen, the blue nodes representing Julian's access blinked once, turned a violent, bleeding red, and then vanished. Connection terminated. Across the bay in my house, Julian's screens would be going black. His passwords would be expiring. His cloud stored secrets, the mistress, the gambling debts, the forged medical degrees were now being sucked into an encrypted Thorne server for Dominic Vane to dissect. He's in the parking garage, Clara said, looking at her tablet. Security just pinged his Tesla. He's trying to leave the estate. Show me, I commanded. Clara swiped the tablet's feed to the boardroom's massive 8K display. The camera at the Napa gate showed Julian's white Tesla Model S screeching towards the exit. He looked frantic, his face pale, one hand gripping the steering wheel while the other stabbed at the center console screen. He was trying to run. He probably had a suitcase full of Isabella's jewelry in the trunk. I picked up my smartphone. I opened the Thorne Fleet Management app. Because the Tesla was a corporate lease vehicle registered under Thorne Genetics, I had the fiduciary liability to ensure it wasn't being used for unauthorized transit. I found the icon for his car, Vehicle '09 Mercer. I tapped the Remote Immobilize command. The app asked for a secondary confirmation. Are you sure you want to engage safety lock? I slid my thumb across the screen. The haptic vibration was a soft, buzzing throb against my skin, a mechanical heartbeat. On the big screen, the Tesla abruptly jerked. The regenerative braking kicked in with the force of a physical wall. The tires hissed against the gravel, leaving two long, black streaks of scorched rubber. The car came to a dead stop exactly 3 feet from the gate. Julian slammed against the steering wheel. I watched him try to open the door, but the electronic latches were dead. He was trapped inside a $100,000 glass and steel coffin. The hazard lights began to flash, a rhythmic orange blink that looked like a heartbeat in distress. Call a tow truck, I told Clara. Have the car brought to the Oakland impound lot, and tell Marcus to have a cardboard box ready. Julian's personal belongings, the things he actually owns, which shouldn't take more than 5 minutes to gather, need to be waiting at the curb. I stood up and walked toward Julian's office, the office that used to be mine. The door opened with a hiss of pneumatic pressure. The room was a shrine to his vanity. Framed photos of him shaking hands with governors, awards for Philanthropist of the Year, and a leather-bound book of his philosophies on wellness. I walked to the desk. I picked up a small crystal paperweight, a gift from Isabella, I presumed. It was a heart-shaped piece of glass. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the cold, sharp edges. I let it go. It hit the floor with a clean, musical shatter. The heart disintegrated into 1,000 jagged diamonds. Clara, I said, not looking back, clear the desk. I want every trace of Julian Mercer stripped from this room by lunch. If it can't be shredded, burn it. And tell the board of directors we are having an emergency session at 1 p.m. We need to discuss a Chapter 11 reorganization of the Eternal Care Project. We're cutting out the rot. I sat in the chair. It was still warm from his ghost, but that would fade. I reached into the drawer and pulled out a fresh white lab coat. I slipped it on, the heavy cotton a familiar weight on my shoulders. I felt the pocket. Inside was a small glass vial I had placed there earlier, the prototype serum. It was empty, a decoy I had filled with a fluorescent vitamin compound. Julian would be coming for this. Even now, trapped in his car, he was thinking of a way to steal the miracle. He thought he knew the sequence. He thought he was the architect. I looked at the shattered crystal on the floor. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I felt the precise, freezing joy of a surgeon who had just successfully removed a tumor. I opened my laptop again. I began to type the code for the real longevity sequence, the one he would never see, the one that would build an empire he could only watch from the outside, through the bars of a prison cell or the window of a minimum wage motel. The air in the room was finally clean. Clara walked back in, her face a mask of clinical efficiency. The tow truck is on site at the estate, Vivian. Julian is refusing to leave the car. He's screaming that you're committing spousal theft. I didn't look up from the glowing green lines of code. Let him scream. It's the only thing he has left. Oh, and Clara, make sure the tow truck takes the scenic route. I want him to have a very long time to think about his fiduciary liability while he sits in the back of a car that no longer listens to him. I hit save. The sequence was locked. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for him to try and steal the blue light. Desperation has a specific frequency, a jagged, high-pitched vibration that bypasses the ears and settles directly in the marrow. I could feel Julian's desperation through the fiber optic cables of the Thorne Genetics security grid. He was no longer a man, he was a cornered animal with a dwindling supply of oxygen, clawing at the walls of the ecosystem I had built. I stood in the darkened observation gallery of Lab Suite 9, my hands resting lightly on the cool, brushed steel railing. Below me, the clean room was bathed in the eerie, ultraviolet glow of the sterilization cycle. Rows of glass incubators hummed with a low choral vibration, each one housing a fragment of the future. In the center of the room, sitting atop a vibration-isolated granite pedestal, was the bait. The prototype serum was contained in a 50 milliliter reinforced borosilicate vial. To the untrained eye, it was a masterpiece of pharmaceutical aesthetics. The liquid inside was a deep, shimmering cerulean, the result of a highly concentrated fluorescent vitamin B12 derivative I'd formulated 3 hours ago. Under the UV lights, it didn't just glow, it pulsed with a seductive alien intelligence. It looked like immortality in a bottle. In reality, it was a liquid parlor trick. He just bypassed the secondary service entrance in the basement. Dominic Vane's voice crackled in my earpiece. The sound was grainy, stripped of warmth. He used an old maintenance override code from the seed funding phase. You were right, Vivian. He never deletes a back door. Let him in, Dominic, I whispered. My voice didn't echo. The acoustic dampening of the gallery swallowed it whole. I want him to feel the weight of his own genius before I crush it. I watched the surveillance monitor on the wall. A pixelated figure in a dark hoodie moved through the shadows of the basement corridor. Julian. The man who had once walked these halls with the swagger of a Roman emperor was now scuttling through the vents like a common rat. He was carrying a portable cryo case, the same one we'd used during our Series A pitch to impressed venture capitalists. Back then, it had held hope. Now it was a coffin for his pride. He reached the airlock of Lab 9. I watched him input his biometric data. Access denied. He tried again, his movements frantic, the infrared camera capturing the heat blooming in his face, a dark, angry purple on the thermal scan. I tapped a command on my tablet. Override, maintenance mode. The airlock hissed. The heavy lead-lined door slid open with a sound like a giant's intake of breath. Julian stumbled into the UV light, blinking against the neon glare. He didn't look like a CEO. His expensive linen shirt was stained with sweat, and his eyes were bloodshot, darting around the room with a wild, hollow hunger. He ignored the millions of dollars of sequencing equipment. He ignored the proprietary cell lines, his gaze locked onto the blue vial. I moved away from the railing, stepping back into the deepest shadows of the gallery. I wanted to see this up close, through the reinforced plexiglass. Julian approached the granite pedestal. He moved with a sickening, reverent slowness. He reached out, his fingers trembling so violently I thought he might drop the cryo case. He set the case down with a metallic clink that resonated through the silent lab. Then he touched the vial. I watched his hand. The skin of his fingers looked translucent under the UV light, the veins dark and branching like a map of a dying city. He gripped the cool glass. The vial was heavy, exactly 142 grams. I had weighted the base to ensure it felt substantial, the way a man like Julian expects power to feel. He lifted it. The blue liquid swirled, the fluorescent molecules catching the light and casting a shimmering electric glow onto his face. For a moment, he looked almost beautiful, a thief crowned in stolen light. He held it up to his eyes, searching for the Thorn Genetics holographic seal on the cap. When he saw it, a jagged, terrifying smile broke across his face. Mine, he whispered. The word was a dry rasp, a puff of carbon dioxide in a room designed for pure oxygen. He didn't know I was 10 feet above him. He didn't know that the prototype serum he was clutching was nothing more than a neon-tinted lie. He thought he was holding the key to a second Series A way to bypass me, to pay Isabella's mounting debts, to reclaim the life of luxury he felt he was owed by divine right. He carefully lowered the vial into the foam-lined interior of the cryo case. The lid snapped shut with a definitive pressurized hiss. Dominic, I said, my voice as cold and flat as the granite below. Trigger the exit path. I want him to think he's escaped. Let him get all the way to the parking lot. Copy that. Opening the service elevator. Dominic replied. Julian turned and fled, his footsteps echoing in the pressurized chamber. He didn't look back. He didn't see the silent shadow watching him from the dark. I walked out of the observation gallery and headed for the server room. The air here was colder, vibrating with the collective hum of 20,000 processors. This was the brain of Thorn Genetics. I sat at the master console, the blue light from the monitors reflected in my pupils. I pulled up Julian's private server, the one he thought was hidden behind a triple-layer firewall. To an algorithm architect, Julian's security was a child's sandcastle. I navigated to the folder labeled Project Phoenix, Investor Pitch. Inside were the documents Julian intended to present to his new partners, A group of high-risk offshore investors who didn't care about ethics as long as the ROI was astronomical. He had spent months secretly drafting these, using Thorne's own seed funding to pay for the legal infrastructure of his betrayal. I opened the primary pitch deck, slide 1, Mercer Longevity, Beyond Thorne. I felt a microscopic twitch in my jaw, the sheer arrogance of the name, his name, stripped of mine. I didn't feel anger. I felt the clinical necessity of a gardener pulling a weed. Julian, I murmured to the empty room, you've always been so obsessed with the look of the science. You never understood the soul of it. I began to modify the deck. I didn't delete his files. That would be too simple. Instead, I subtly altered the data. I changed the solubility coefficients. I shifted the molecular weights of the active ingredients. To anyone but a top tier biochemist, the math would still look brilliant, but when Julian attempted to demonstrate the serum's efficacy or explain the formula he thought he'd stolen, the numbers would lead him into a logical labyrinth with no exit. And then I added the final touch. I embedded a small, hidden script in the metadata of the pitch deck, a digital UV light. The moment he opened this file on an external network, it would trigger a silent IP audit alert to the SEC and my legal team, time-stamped with his GPS coordinates. I hit upload. The progress bar crawled across the screen with a mesmerizing mechanical pace: 10%, 45%, 88%. Complete. The trap was no longer just a physical room in a lab, it was a digital ghost that would follow him wherever he went. Vivian, Dominic's voice came through again. He's in his car, a rental. He's heading for a private airfield in San Jose. It looks like he's got a meeting scheduled for midnight. Isabella? I asked. She's already there, waiting in the hangar. She thinks she's flying to the Caymans. I stood up, smoothing the front of my white lab coat. The fabric felt crisp, unyielding. I walked to the window. In the distance, the lights of San Francisco were a scattered pile of jewels against the black velvet of the bay. Somewhere out there, Julian was clutching a blue vial, believing he had stolen the sun. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I dialed a number I hadn't used in years. Rowan, it's Vivian. I'm calling to apologize for the short notice, but I think you should be at the San Jose private terminal in an hour. There's a miracle being sold tonight, and I thought you'd like to be the first to witness the side effects. I hung up. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass. I didn't look like a martyr anymore. I didn't look like the woman who had died in a Swiss clinic, gasping for oxygen that wasn't there. I looked like the person Julian should have been afraid of from the very beginning. I walked out of the server room, the sound of the cooling fans fading behind me. The office was quiet, the air finally free of the scent of Santal 33. I had the real sequence locked in my mind, a $1 billion legacy that Julian would never touch. He thought he was the thief. He didn't realize that in this game, the only thing he had actually stolen was his own arrest warrant. In the back seat of his rental car, Julian opened the cryo case and stared at the blue vial. The light from the serum illuminated his face, casting deep, ghoulish shadows under his eyes. He didn't see the tiny, microscopic camera embedded in the foam lining. He didn't see the red recording dot on the master console in Lab 9. He simply pressed the vial to his lips, not to drink, but to kiss the cold glass of his victory. Goodbye, Vivienne, he whispered to the darkness. He had no idea I was watching him through the very light he thought was his salvation. The blue glow was beautiful. It was mesmerizing, and in 2 hours it would turn his entire world into a cage. The San Jose private terminal smelled of kerosene, wet asphalt, and the distinct metallic tang of desperate greed. It was a cavernous space, the hangar's corrugated steel walls magnifying the low-frequency hum of a Gulfstream G650 idling on the apron. Rain lashed against the skylights, a frantic, percussive sound that felt like thousands of tiny fingers trying to claw their way inside. I sat in the darkened interior of my SUV, parked 50 yards from the hangar's side entrance. The leather of the seat was cold against my thighs, even through the heavy silk of my Givenchy dress. I didn't turn on the heater. I wanted to feel the chill. I wanted my nerves to be as sharp and brittle as ice. On the dash, my tablet flickered with a dozen live feeds. Dominic Vane had wired the hangar with high-resolution pinhole cameras 2 hours ago. I watched Julian move across the concrete floor. He was a different man now. The hoodie was gone, replaced by a bespoke navy blazer he'd kept in a locker at the marina. He was adjusting his cuffs, his movements jerky and over-caffeinated. Beside him stood Isabella Rossi. She looked like a woman who had already spent the money she hadn't yet made. She was draped in a mink coat I recognized. Julian had billed it to the Thorne Genetics Series B research fund as specialized lab equipment. I watched Julian open the cryo case. The blue light of the prototype serum spilled out, illuminating his face in a ghoulish electric glow. He looked at the vial with a hunger that was almost pornographic. Rowan is here. Dominic's voice whispered in my ear. He's bringing 2 partners from Blackstone Equity. They think they're here for a private IPO preview. Perfect, I murmured. My pulse remained a flat, steady line. Let the curtain rise. I opened the car door and stepped out into the rain. The water was freezing, but I didn't move to cover myself. I walked toward the hangar, the sound of my heels muffled by the wind. I entered through the service door, slipping into the shadows of the mezzanine level. Overlooking the boardroom, Julian had set up on a makeshift stage of expensive rugs and folding tables. Below me, Julian was in full performance mode. He stood before 3 men in tailored overcoats, the kings of Silicon Valley venture capital. Rowan Blackwell sat in the center, his face a mask of polite, professional skepticism. "What you are looking at, gentlemen," Julian said, his voice echoing in the vast space, "is the end of the Thorne monopoly." Vivian Thorne was always too cautious, too buried in her ethics to see the commercial potential of the longevity sequence. I have streamlined the formula. I have removed the safety buffers that were holding back the Thorne stock price. He picked up the blue vial. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, rotating it slowly. I watched the liquid swirl, a shimmering, seductive cerulean. "This is the Mercer Longevity Serum," Julian continued, his eyes bright with a manic, delusional light. "A single injection, and cellular senescence is halted. No more Thorne Genetics bureaucratic red tape. We launch our own Series A tomorrow. By the time Vivian realizes the patent has been breached, we'll be offshore and untouchable." Rowan Blackwell leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the blue glow. "And the safety data, Julian? The Thorne clinical trials were extensive. You're claiming a total bypass of the standard protocol?" "Vivian's trials were a waste of time." Julian scoffed, a jagged, arrogant laugh barking out of his chest. "I have run my own tests. The results are transformative. The market cap for this won't be in the billions. It will be the global economy itself. Who doesn't want to live forever?" Isabella stepped forward. her hand resting on Julian's shoulder in a gesture of shared triumph. We have already secured the manufacturing site in Singapore. All we need is the bridge funding to clear the hangar. It was time. I reached for my phone. I didn't hesitate. I opened the security app and navigated to the lighting controls for Hangar 4. I found the master switch for the overhead high-intensity UV arrays, the ones used for disinfecting the aircraft cabins after long-haul flights. I pressed the icon. Click. The sound of the virtual switch was a sharp, digital snap. The reaction in the hangar was a violent neon explosion. The massive UV lamps hummed to life with a sharp, ozone-scented buzz. The warm, amber light of the hangar was instantly replaced by a blinding, electric, violet glare. Julian stopped mid-sentence, his arm still raised, holding the vial aloft like a trophy. "What the—" Rowan Blackwell shielded his eyes, looking up at the rafters. "Julian, what the hell is this?" "Must be a surge," Julian shouted, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "Isabella, find the breaker." But Julian didn't look at Isabella. He looked at his own hands. In the first-person absolute focus of my mind, I watched the horror take hold. Under the intense UV luminescence, the serum inside the vial was reacting exactly as I had designed it. But it wasn't just the vial. Julian's skin, the skin of his hands, his neck, his face, it began to bloom with a vibrant neon blue stain. Because he had spent the last 3 hours frantically handling the concentrated fluorescent compound in the leaky prototype case, the dye had permeated his pores. It was invisible in normal light, but under the UV lamps, Julian Mercer looked like a radioactive ghost. He looked like a walking biohazard. "Julian!" Isabella cried out, stepping away from him, her face twisting in a look of pure, visceral disgust. "Your face! Your hands!" Julian looked into the polished chrome of the cryo case. He saw his own reflection, a ghoulish, glowing blue monster. He dropped the vial. The borosilicate glass hit the concrete floor with a sound like a gunshot, a sharp shatter. The cerulean liquid exploded outward, a glowing neon puddle spreading across the expensive rugs. It looked like Julian's lifeblood was being drained out of him in a pool of electric blue ink. "What is this?" Rowan Blackwell stood up, his voice cold and sharp as a scalpel. He looked at the blue man, then at the glowing puddle on the floor. "Is this your serum, Julian? A bottle of highlighter fluid?" "No, it is a mistake, a contamination." Julian scrambled on the floor, his blue hands clawing at the broken glass, trying to scoop up the liquid. He looked pathetic, a thief trying to gather the pieces of a lie. I stepped out from the shadows of the mezzanine. I walked slowly down the steel stairs, the sound of my heels a cold, rhythmic death march. "It is not a contamination, Rowan," I said, my voice carrying through the hangar with the weight of an executioner's final word. "It is a marker." The group turned. Julian froze on the floor, his blue face looking up at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. "Vivian," he whispered. I walked into the circle of investors, my expression a mask of clinical detachment. I didn't look at the mess on the floor. I looked at Rowan. "Mr. Blackwell," I said, my voice flat and professional. "What you are witnessing is a textbook case of clinical trial fraud and IP theft. The liquid on the floor is a non-toxic fluorescent tracer used in Thorne Genetics to detect leaks in the waste management system. It has zero medicinal value. It is, however, excellent at identifying parasites." Rowan Blackwell looked at the blue man on the rugs, then back at me. He didn't smile, but a glint of dark respect shone in his eyes. "I see. And the pitch deck, Vivian?" The Mercer longevity data? A total fabrication, I replied, standing over Julian. The UV light made my white silk dress look like it was carved from moonstone. I modified the files Julian stole from my server 3 hours ago. If he had actually understood the science, he would have known the solubility coefficients were impossible. But Julian never cared for the science. He only cared for the glow. Julian stood up, his blue chest heaving. He looked at Isabella, reaching out a glowing hand. Isabella, tell them. We have the other files. We have the Singapore site. Isabella Rossi didn't reach back. She backed away, her mink coat pulled tight around her, as if to shield herself from his failure. Don't touch me, Julian. You're a freak. You told me you owned the patents. You told me she was a dead woman walking. And you, I said, turning my gaze to Isabella, you've been billing Thorne Genetics for consultancy services for 18 months. My forensic team has traced every cent of that money to your offshore account in Grand Cayman. That's wire fraud, Isabella. And given the amount, it's a federal SEC indictment waiting to happen. Isabella's face turned the color of ash. She looked at Julian, then at me, then bolted for the hangar door. Let her go, I said to Dominic, who had appeared in the shadows. The FBI is already waiting at the terminal gate. She won't make it to her Uber. I turned back to Julian. He was alone now, standing in a pool of blue ink, his skin glowing like a dying star in the violet light. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a jagged, vibrating hatred. You think you've won, Vivian? He spat, his voice a dry, desperate rasp. You're still a cold, barren bitch in a lab coat. You have your patents, but I had your life. I had your trust. You had my mercy, Julian, I said, stepping closer until I could smell the ozone and the sweat. And you traded it for highlighter fluid. You thought you were the architect of my destruction, but you were just the test subject in a very successful experiment in asset recovery. I reached out and clicked the UV switch on my phone. Click. The violet light vanished. The warm amber glow of the hangar returned. Julian was no longer a glowing ghost. In the normal light, he just looked like a man in a stained blazer, standing over a broken bottle of blue dye. He looked small. He looked finished. Rowan Blackwell stood up and straightened his coat. Vivian, I think Thorne Genetics is overdue for a Series B expansion. Perhaps we can discuss the real longevity sequence tomorrow, without the distractions. I look forward to it, Rowan, I said. I didn't look at Julian as Rowan and the investors walked out. I didn't look at him as the sirens of the FBI began to wail outside the hangar doors. I simply picked up the cryo case, the one I'd bought with my own money, and walked toward my car. The rain was still falling, but the air felt clean. I sat in the back of my SUV watching the red and blue lights of the federal agents reflect in the hangar windows. Dominic Vane sat in the driver's seat. Julian is in custody, Vivian. He's claiming you poisoned him. I looked at my hands, steady, warm, and free of any stain. I didn't poison him, Dominic. I just turned on the lights. He did the rest to himself. I leaned back and closed my eyes. Julian Mercer was a blue-stained memory now. Tomorrow I would build the empire he could only dream of. The game wasn't over. It was just finally being played by a professional. The digital silence of my private office was a sanctuary of high-frequency precision. Outside, the fog of the San Francisco Bay pressed against the triple-paned glass, a gray, formless weight. Inside, the only light came from the three 32-inch monitors on my desk, glowing altars of forensic accounting. I sat with my spine perfectly aligned against the lumbar support of my chair. I wasn't resting. I was a hunter at a terminal. My pulse remained at a resting 62 beats per minute as I watched the data streams of the Mercer Thorne joint accounts reorganize themselves into a map of betrayal. Dominic Vane sat across from me, his face a shadow in the dim light. He pushed a pair of high-fidelity open-back headphones toward me. They were heavy, the leather ear cups smelling of cedar and cold electronics. "This is from the bug Isabella didn't find in her mink coat," Dominic said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. "Recorded 48 hours ago, right before the hangar debacle. Julian thought the line was secure. They were discussing the exit strategy for the girl." I picked up the headphones. The tension in the headband was exactly calibrated. I slid them over my ears, the world outside vanishing into a vacuum-sealed void. My thumb hovered over the play icon on the screen. The glass of the monitor felt cool, a barrier between me and the filth I was about to hear. Click. The audio was grainy at first, a chaotic wash of white noise and the distant clink of ice in a glass. Then a voice cut through. Julian! But not the charming Julian of the Napa Vineyards. This was the Julian of the Oakland Motel, jagged, desperate, and dripping with venom. "She's a $5 million asset, Isabella. Stop crying about the boarding school. Vivian has already paid for the initial gene therapy. If we play this right, the girl stays in a Thorne-funded trust for the next 20 years. We don't even have to see her. We just collect the management fee." Then Isabella's voice, high-pitched, frantic, stripped of its silk. "And if she asks for her mother? Julian, she's 5. She's starting to look like me. If Vivian sees her in the light, she'll know." "Vivian sees what I tell her to see," Julian hissed. The sound of a glass hitting a table was a sharp, percussive crack in my ears. "She's a scientist. She believes in data, not eyes. As long as the forged clinical trial reports keep coming from Rome, she'll keep signing the checks. By the time the girl is 10, we'll be liquidated and gone. The girl is a ghost, Isabella, a high-yield ghost." I felt a microscopic tightening in my chest, not of grief, but of a cold, predatory recognition. This was the wire fraud in its purest form. They weren't just stealing my money, they were leveraging a human life as a financial instrument. I took the headphones off. I didn't slam them down. I placed them back on the desk with a slow, deliberate grace. The silence of the office rushed back in, but it was different now. It was charged. "Trace the Rome wire transfers again," I commanded. My voice was a flat, clinical drone. "I want the specific IP addresses used to upload the forged medical data to the Thorne genetics cloud. I want the timestamp of every Sister Maria email. And Dominic? Yeah. Find out Isabella's price. Her price?" Dominic tilted his head, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Every mistress has a liquidation value," I said, leaning back into the leather chair. "She doesn't want the girl. She wants the lifestyle the girl represents. Find out the exact amount Julian promised her in the Cayman account. I'm going to make her an offer that bypasses Julian's crumbling ego." 3 hours later, my phone vibrated on the mahogany desk. A text from Julian. He was out on bail, funded by a high-interest predatory lender, no doubt. "Vivian, we need to talk. Not about the lab, about Mia. She's sick, truly sick this time. You're the only mother she's ever known. Don't let your anger kill a child." I looked at the screen, the blue light reflected in my eyes. He was playing the only card he had left, the hostage, the orphan. He thought he could still use my motherly ghost to haunt my checkbook. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened a new file on my desktop: Custody Agreement, Termination of Parental Rights. I began to type. The sound of the mechanical keyboard was a series of rhythmic, metallic staccatos, the sound of a machine gun firing in slow motion. I wasn't just drafting a legal document, I was building a cage. The next morning, the fog had lifted, revealing a city of hard edges and glass. I met Isabella Rossi in a small, windowless conference room in the basement of a law firm near the Tenderloin. The air was stale, smelling of old paper and desperation. Isabella sat across from me. She looked like a bird that had been plucked and left in the rain. Her mink was gone, replaced by a cheap trench coat. Her eyes were red, darting toward the door as if expecting the FBI to burst in. I placed a single cream-colored envelope on the table. "Julian is broke, Isabella," I said. No greeting, no empathy, just the data. The predatory loan he took for bail has a 30% interest rate. The SEC has frozen his hidden accounts. By the end of the week, he won't be able to afford a bus pass, let alone a flight to the Caymans. Isabella swallowed hard. The sound was audible in the small room. He said, he said you were going to jail for the blue light setup. Julian says many things. Most of them are blackmail attempts that my legal team has already neutralized, I replied. I pushed the envelope toward her. It slid across the wood with a soft, shushing sound. Inside is a ticket to Zurich and the access code to a private vault. There is $500,000 in cash. Untraceable. It's exactly half of what Julian promised you. But this half actually exists. Isabella reached for the envelope, her fingers shaking. "Wait," I said. My voice was a sudden, freezing wait. She stopped, her hand hovering an inch from the paper. "The price of the envelope is simple," I continued. "You sign the custody agreement. You admit, under oath, that Mia is your biological child by Julian Mercer. You admit that the Rome orphanage story was a fabrication designed to facilitate wire fraud. And then you vanish. You never see the girl again. You never speak to Julian again. You become a ghost, Isabella, just like you wanted her to be." Isabella looked at the envelope, then she looked at me. There was no motherly hesitation. There was no flicker of, "What about my daughter?" There was only the calculation of a parasite deciding which host to abandon. "He'll kill me," she whispered. "Julian can't even kill his own shadow right now," I said. "Sign the paper, Isabella, or I hand the bugged mink coat recordings to the U.S. Attorney's Office in 10 minutes. You can choose the Swiss Alps or a federal cell in Dublin, California. I don't care which." I pulled a heavy, silver-barreled pen from my pocket. I placed it on top of the agreement. I watched her. I watched the way her pupils dilated as she looked at the pen. I watched the way her hand moved, clumsy, frantic, reaching for the silver instrument. She didn't read the clauses. She didn't check the fine print. She just wanted the exit. She signed. The ink was a dark, wet blue. It looked like the serum in the hanger. "Done," she gasped, pushing the paper back toward me. I picked up the agreement. I checked the signature. It was a messy, jagged scrawl, the signature of a woman who had just sold her child for a $500,000 head start. "Dominic will escort you to the airport," I said, standing up. I didn't look at her again. "The vault code will activate once your flight enters international airspace. If you attempt to contact Julian, the vault incinerates the contents. Do I make myself clear?" She nodded, clutching the envelope to her chest like a holy relic. I walked out of the room. The hallway was bright, clinical, and empty. I felt a surge of cold, dark satisfaction. I had the confession. I had the child's real identity, and I had the weapon that would finally put Julian Mercer in the dirt. As I reached the elevator, my phone buzzed. Another text from Julian. Vivian, please. I'm at the Napa house. Mia is asking for you. She's crying. Just come and talk to her. One last time. I looked at the custody agreement in my hand. I looked at Isabella's jagged signature. I typed my first reply to him in 48 hours. I'm coming, Julian, but I'm not coming as a mother. I'm coming as a creditor. Have the tea ready. I stepped into the elevator and watched the doors close, my reflection staring back at me from the brushed steel. I didn't look like a victim of a husband's greed. I looked like a woman who had just liquidated a nightmare. Julian thought Mia was his shield. He had no idea that I had just turned her into his primary evidence. I was going back to Napa, and this time the only thing that was going to be orphan was his future. I pulled a heavy, silver barreled pen from my pocket. I placed it on top of the agreement. I watched her. I watched the way her pupils dilated as she looked at the pen. I watched the way her hand moved, clumsy, frantic, reaching for the silver instrument. She didn't read the clauses. She didn't check the fine print. She just wanted the exit. She signed. The ink was a dark, wet blue. It looked like the serum in the hanger. Done, she gasped, pushing the paper back toward me. I picked up the agreement. I checked the signature. It was a messy, jagged scrawl, the signature of a woman who had just sold her child for a $500,000 head start. Dominic will escort you to the airport, I said, standing up. I didn't look at her again. The vault code will activate once your flight enters international airspace. If you attempt to contact Julian, the vault incinerates the contents. Do I make myself clear? She nodded, clutching the envelope to her chest like a holy relic. I walked out of the room. The hallway was bright, clinical, and empty. I felt a surge of cold, dark satisfaction. I had the confession, I had the child's real identity, and I had the weapon that would finally put Julian Mercer in the dirt. As I reached the elevator, my phone buzzed. Another text from Julian. Vivian, please, I'm at the Napa house. Mia is asking for you. She's crying. Just come and talk to her. One last time. I looked at the custody agreement in my hand. I looked at Isabella's jagged signature. I typed my first reply to him in 48 hours. I'm coming, Julian, but I'm not coming as a mother. I'm coming as a creditor. Have the tea ready. I stepped into the elevator and watched the doors close, my reflection staring back at me from the brushed steel. I didn't look like a victim of a husband's greed. I looked like a woman who had just liquidated a nightmare. Julian thought Mia was his shield. He had no idea that I had just turned her into his primary evidence. I was going back to Napa, and this time the only thing that was going to be orphan was his future. The boys, Mia is upstairs. She finally fell asleep, he said, his eyes searching mine for a flicker of the woman who used to believe him. I made tea, Earl Grey, your favorite. I didn't move. I stood in the doorway, my Givenchy coat still damp, looking at the steam rising from the cup. In my first life, this was the moment the neurotoxin began its 3-year journey into my marrow. The tea, the ritual of caring. Sit, please, he urged, his hand trembling as he set the cup on a silver coaster. The porcelain clicked against the metal with a high, fragile sound. We can fix this, Vivian. I know I was aggressive at the hangar. Desperation makes a man do strange things, but Mia needs us together. I walked to the table, but I didn't sit. I placed my briefcase on the mahogany surface. I watched Julian's eyes dart toward it. He thought there was a check inside. He thought I was here to negotiate the price of his silence. I've been busy today, Julian, I said. My voice was a flat, clinical drone echoing in the high-ceilinged room. I've spent the last 6 hours executing a trust decanting, the joint accounts, the Napa Estates Maintenance Fund, even the secondary trust for Mia's education. It's all been poured into a new, single fiduciary entity, one you cannot touch. Julian's face went the color of ash. He set the teacup down, his fingers fumbling with the handle. You, you can't decant a marital trust without both signatures. That's illegal. It's perfectly legal when the secondary beneficiary is under investigation for clinical trial fraud, I replied. I flipped the latches on my briefcase. Snap, snap. The sound was like two dry bones breaking. I reached inside and pulled out the document Isabella Rossi had signed 4 hours ago. I didn't hand it to him. I laid it on the table right next to the steaming tea. Isabella is gone, Julian, I said. She's on a flight to Zurich, but she left me a gift, a full confession, under oath. Mia isn't your sister's child. She's yours and Isabella's. The Rome orphanage files were a fabrication. The Sister Maria emails were sent from a VPN in Oakland. It's all here. Every lie, every wire fraud transaction, every forged blood count. Julian reached for the paper, his blue-stained fingers. The dye was still faintly visible around his cuticles, snatching at the edges. I watched his eyes scan the text. I watched the way his throat worked as he swallowed, a jagged, desperate motion. She lied, he hissed, his voice cracking. She's a mistress, Vivian. You're going to take the word of a woman you just paid off over your husband. I'm taking the word of the DNA test Isabella provided before she left, I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I didn't look at it as I tapped a command. And I'm taking the word of the whistleblower report I just filed with the SEC. Every cent you diverted from Thorn Genetics to your eternal care shell is now classified as grand larceny. Julian lunged across the table, his hand reaching for my throat. I didn't flinch. I didn't move an inch, because at that exact moment the library's heavy glass doors swung open. 4 men in windbreakers with SEC asset seizure emblazoned in yellow on the back stepped into the room. Behind them were 2 SFPD officers. The lead agent, a man with a face like a stone cliff, stepped forward. Julian Mercer? The agent asked. Julian froze, his hand inches from my face. He looked at the agents, then at the police, then back at me. The predator was gone. All that was left was a cornered rat in a silk shirt. We have a warrant for an immediate asset seizure and your arrest for wire fraud and misappropriation of corporate funds, the agent continued. The property is being vacated. Now. Vacated? Julian stammered, his eyes wide. But the girl, Mia is upstairs. You can't just throw a child out into the rain. Mia is being picked up by Isabella's legal representative, I said, my voice cutting through his panic like a surgical blade. And by legal representative, I mean a court-appointed guardian who will be overseeing her transition to Zurich. You signed away your post-nuptial rights to this house, Julian. You signed them away the moment you used the estate as collateral for your predatory bail loan. I picked up the teacup. I looked at the dark, fragrant liquid. I held it out toward him. You made this for me, didn't you? I asked. Julian stared at the cup, his chest heaving. He didn't speak. I slowly tilted the porcelain. The hot tea spilled out, a dark, steaming ribbon that hit the white Persian rug. It looked like a spreading bruise on the fabric. I watched the liquid soak into the fibers until the cup was empty. The tea is cold, Julian, I said. I set the empty cup back on the coaster. "Wait!" Julian screamed as the officers grabbed his arms. "Vivian, you're a thorn. You care about the name. If this goes to trial, the name is ruined. I'll tell everyone about the sequences. I'll tell them the longevity serum is a lie." "The only lie in this room is you," I said. I watched the officers drag him toward the foyer. His heels left long, jagged marks in the hallway's polished wood. He was screaming now, vile, incoherent threats that dissolved into the sound of the rain. I stood in the silence of the library. The SEC agents began to move through the room, placing yellow, seized stickers on the mahogany desk, the Dutch oil paintings, the leather-bound books. They were stripping his world down to the bone. Dominic Vane stepped into the room, his coat dripping onto the hardwood. "He's in the back of the cruiser, Vivian. The towels and his clothes are in the box at the curb, just like you asked." "And the girl?" I asked. "En route to SFO. Isabella's lawyer met the car. She's safe, and she'll never know she was almost a $5 million ghost." I walked to the window. The police lights, red and blue, were dancing across the vineyard's wet leaves. It looked like the hangar all over again. Neon and ruin. I reached out and touched the glass. It was freezing. "Liquidate everything, Dominic," I ordered. My voice was a razor-sharp command of absolute power. The house, the furniture, the cars, every trace of the Mercer name needs to be scrubbed from the Thorn history books. I want this estate listed for sale by morning. We are moving the headquarters to Zurich. "You are leaving?" Dominic asked. "I am ascending," I corrected firmly. I looked at the empty teacup on the table. It was a small, fragile thing, a relic of a life I had already outlived. I picked it up and walked to the fireplace. I held it over the flames until the porcelain was hot enough to sting my fingers, and then I let go. The cup hit the hearth and shattered into 1,000 white shards. The fire flared for a second, a bright orange roar, before settling back into a low, steady glow. My heart beat with a steady, unshakable rhythm. My lungs were full of clean, crisp air. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, I was finally, legally, and biologically alone. I walked out of the Thorn estate without looking back. As the town car pulled away, I looked at the mansion in the rearview mirror. The red and blue lights were fading, leaving the house in a cold, gray shadow. Julian was gone. Mia was gone. Isabella was gone. I opened my laptop and looked at the real longevity sequence, the one that had never been touched by a parasite. "The coronation begins at dawn," I stated to the dark cabin. I tapped the send button on an email to the global press. The headline was simple and absolute. "Thorn Genetics announces global headquarters move, reveals the cure for time." The game was over. The empire was mine, and the only thing I had to worry about now was how to spend a century of absolute, unadulterated success. The D. Young Museum in San Francisco had been transformed into a cathedral of light and glass. Outside, the park was shrouded in a soft, rolling fog, but inside, the air was warm, smelling of lilies, expensive silk, and the ozone-sharp scent of absolute power. This was the Thorn Gala, the official celebration of Thorn Genetics' 10-year anniversary and its recent market cap milestone of $500 billion. I stood on the mezzanine balcony, my hands resting lightly on the cold marble railing. I was wearing a gown of midnight blue velvet that felt like a second skin, heavy and unyielding. On my left hand, the 10-carat emerald-cut diamond ring Tommy had given me catch the light, refracting tiny, jagged rainbows across the ceiling. It was a weight I carried with a clinical ease. Below me, the board of directors, the titans of Silicon Valley, and the heads of every major pharmaceutical house on the planet moved like schools of well-fed fish. They were here to pay homage to the woman who had conquered time. "The Swiss data is in," a voice said behind me. I didn't turn. I recognized the low, rhythmic cadence of Dominic Vane. He moved into the light beside me, looking uncomfortable in a tuxedo that cost more than a Midwestern home. "Isabella Rossi was spotted in a village outside of Lugano," Dominic continued. "She's working as a waitress in a roadside diner. The 500,000 you gave her is gone, spent on bad investments and a series of legal fees to keep the Italian tax authorities away. She has nothing left but the clothes on her back and a passport she can't afford to renew." I took a slow sip of my vintage Bollinger. The bubbles were sharp and cold against my tongue, a series of microscopic explosions. "And the girl?" "Mia is in a boarding school in Geneva under a Thorne-funded alias. She's top of her class in molecular biology. She thinks her parents died in a car crash. She's happy, Vivian. She has a life that isn't a financial instrument." I nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. The debt to the girl was settled. The high-yield ghost was finally a person. "And Julian?" I asked. My voice was a flat, clinical hum. Dominic paused. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, grainy photograph. He laid it on the marble railing. "He was released from federal prison 3 months ago. He's back in the city, working for a third-party maintenance crew. He didn't have anywhere else to go." I picked up the photo. It was a long-lens shot of a man standing outside a transit station. He looked 70, though he was only in his early 60s. The silver fox charisma was gone, replaced by a gray, sagging, hollowed-out look. His eyes were dim, the pupils perpetually dilated as if searching for a light that had been extinguished a decade ago. I set the photo down. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I felt the same detached satisfaction a scientist feels when observing the final decay of a dead culture in a petri dish. "Is he here tonight?" I asked. "He's on the basement crew, cleaning the service corridors," Dominic said. "I can have him removed." "No," I said, a cold, dark smile touching my lips. "Let him work. I want the floors to be spotless." I walked down the grand staircase, the velvet of my dress sweeping the marble with a soft, shushing sound. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. I felt the collective weight of their gaze, a mix of awe, fear, and a desperate desire to be in my orbit. I reached the center of the room. Tommy, Julian Tommy Waite, was waiting for me. He stood tall, his posture reflecting a decade of shared victories and mutual respect. He wasn't a parasite, he was a partner. He held out a glass of champagne, his fingers brushing mine with a warmth that was real. "To the Queen," he whispered. "To the legacy," I replied. We moved through the gala, a series of choreographed handshakes and high-level negotiations. I discussed a hostile takeover of a rival lab in Boston. I finalized the details for the Thorne Genetics IPO on the London Exchange. Every word was a move on a global chessboard, and I was the only one who could see all the pieces. Around midnight, I made an excuse to step away. I walked toward the back of the museum, past the modern art galleries, toward the service elevator. I told the guard I was checking on the catering logistics. The elevator took me to the basement. The air here was different, cooler, smelling of floor wax and industrial strength bleach. The glamour of the gala was a distant, muffled hum above me. I turned the corner into the service corridor, and there he was. Julian Mercer was kneeling on the floor, his back to me. He was wearing a gray industrial jumpsuit with a quick logistics patch on the shoulder. He was scrubbing a scuff mark off the white tile, his movements slow, rhythmic, and beaten. I stood in the center of the hallway. I didn't hide. I let the click of my heels against the concrete announce my presence. Julian froze. I watched the muscles in his back tense, a jagged tremor running through his shoulders. He didn't turn around at first. He just stayed there, kneeling in his own cleaning suds. "The corner needs more work, Julian," I said. My voice was a scalpel cutting through the silence of the basement. He slowly turned. He had to look up to see me. He was kneeling at my feet, the gray fabric of his jumpsuit stained with dirty water. His face was a map of ruin, deep, permanent lines etched into his forehead, his skin sallow and thin. He stared at me. He looked at the midnight blue velvet. He looked at the emerald cut diamond. He looked at the woman who had died in his arms in Switzerland, and then he looked at the goddess standing before him. "Vivian," he whispered. His voice was a dry rasp, the sound of wind through dead leaves. "It's Dr. Thorne," I corrected. I looked down at him, my expression a mask of absolute clinical detachment. Julian's eyes filled with a sudden, frantic moisture. He reached out a hand that was cracked, red, and shaking. He didn't try to touch me. He just hovered it in the air, a beggar's gesture. "Please," he choked out. "Vivian, the boys, my mother, she died alone in that hospice. I have nothing. I'm living in a shelter in the mission. Just one check. For old time's sake, you have so much. What is $1,000 to you? It's a rounding error." I looked at the mop bucket. I looked at the gray water swirling inside. "In our first life, Julian, I was the rounding error," I said. I stepped closer, my shadow falling over him, a dark, velvet weight. "I was the utility that expired. I was the woman you unplugged because you were late for a dinner reservation." Julian blinked, a flash of pure, unadulterated terror crossing his face. "Unplugged? What are you talking about? I would never." "You did," I said, "in a reality you were too greedy to realize existed. You killed me, Julian, and in this life I simply returned the favor. I didn't use a neurotoxin. I used the truth." I reached into my silk clutch and pulled out a single dollar bill. I dropped it. I watched the paper flutter through the air, a slow, zigzagging descent. It landed in the dirty water of his mop bucket. "That's for the floor," I said. "Make sure it's dry before the guests leave. I wouldn't want anyone to slip." Julian stared at the dollar bill floating in the suds. His face crumpled. He began to sob, a quiet, pathetic sound that echoed in the sterile hallway. He didn't look like a villain. He didn't even look like a man. He looked like the debris of a storm he had insisted on starting. I turned and walked away. I didn't look back as the service elevator doors closed. I didn't look back as the elevator ascended toward the light and the lilies and the champagne. When I returned to the mezzanine, Tommy was waiting. He handed me a fresh glass of Bollinger. "Everything all right?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "Perfect," I said. I looked out over the gala, at the empire I had built, at the future I had stolen back from the void. The debris has been cleared. 10 hours later, I was sitting on the terrace of our villa in Tuscany. The sun was a warm, heavy blanket over the rows of grapevines. Tommy was inside, playing a game of chess with our 2-year-old daughter, Charlotte. I could hear her laughter, a bright silver sound that was the only music I ever needed. I leaned back in the wicker chair and took a deep breath. The air was sweet with the scent of lavender and ancient stone. My lungs were full. My heart was a steady, rhythmic drum. I looked at the empty seat beside me. For a second, I saw the ghost of the woman from the Swiss clinic, the one with the paper-thin skin and the hollow eyes. I didn't turn away from her. I looked at her and I smiled. We made it, I thought. I picked up my glass of wine and held it up to the sun. The liquid was a deep, glowing red, the color of life, the color of a heart that refuses to stop beating. I had died once to learn how to live. I had lost everything to learn how to own the world. And as I watched my daughter's laughter rise into the Italian sky, I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't the blue light, or the prison cell, or the mop bucket. It was the fact that I was here to see the sun, and Julian Mercer was just a smudge of dirt on a floor I had already walked across. I closed my eyes and let the warmth take me. The coronation was over, the rain had begun, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I was finally, peacefully asleep. The world will remember Vivian Thorne as the woman who cured age. They will write books about my patents, my boardrooms, and my billions, but the only data that matters is the sound of the wind in the vines and the steady, unbroken rhythm of my own breath. I am Vivian Thorne. I am the architect of the future, and I am finally, unforgettably alive.